Well, cool. Let's go ahead and get started. So thrilled you're here to join us today. I'm Justin Clifford. I work at Bereave, and I'll be your host today. Loss Leaders is a program centered around how companies could, and we think should, step up when loss occurs in the lives of their employees. And the reason that we do these programs, Bereave is on a mission to help companies provide a better bereavement experience when their teammates suffer a loss. And in this pursuit, we meet incredible people that can bring so much education to business leaders that are working to build a more compassionate and empathetic workplace. So this is our effort to get them in front of you. And we do these, if this is your first time, we do these usually twice a month, more or less. Chat is open and we'll monitor for questions. We're going to go to roughly 45 past the hour. We'll have recordings available via LinkedIn and our website by the end of the week, usually before the end of the day if we're lucky. Lastly, quick reminder that this program is SHRM PDC approved. So if you're looking for credits, if you need the credits, we can provide the code at the end and we'll do that in the follow-up as well. We're lucky, super lucky today to be joined by our friend Alex Seiler. Alex is a highly respected chief people officer, having worked at some of the most recognizable companies in the world, companies like NBCUniversal, WeWork, Time, Ogilvy, Citi. Also is a startup advisor to 3 HR tech companies. You might know When Insurance, Kindred Minds, and Change Engine. Alex is incredibly public about his approach to people leadership and is consistently on a mission to really help lift the people in HR function to new heights. Alex, we're thrilled and humbled. Welcome to Loss Leaders.
Thank you, Justin. Really happy to be here, especially on a topic that, as you know, is very near and dear to my heart. And I think needs more eyes on it. So I'm glad that we have like a captive audience today as well.
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you for that. And you've been very open and public about how loss has fit into your life. So let's just go right to this opportunity, and we'll start by honoring, as I say, mom. You say mom, but honor your mom, Sandy. Again, you've been really open about her passing and how it has impacted you. Can we maybe start with a story about Sandy that might help us remember her and continue her legacy after today? Maybe share some of the wisdom that she bestowed upon you.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think so. Actually, in a couple of days, it'll be 6 months since she passed, just as we're approaching U.S. Mother's Day. I think the moment really that stands out in my mind right now, for me, and will always be sort of etched in my memory at this point, was last April when, so my mother battled many forms of cancer over 12 years, beat a number of them. And then her most recent form of cancer, which was esophageal cancer, it had metastasized to her liver. And we found that out last April. And I happened to be visiting in England at the time, just by happenstance when she got that news. And afterwards, obviously, she was in shock. And I think sort of her life was sort of flashing before her eyes. But she kind of pulled me to the side and said, I couldn't be more proud of you. And you're the best thing that I did in my life. It's not like we weren't always open with each other and our feelings anyway. But that's something I definitely, wanted/needed to hear. And I think we said all the things before she passed, which I recognize not everyone gets the chance to do. So I'm beyond grateful for that as well. And as far as her wisdom, I think it's really the life lessons that she taught me. There were a couple things. My dad's Swiss. I think from what I can tell, he's also on this this live stream right now too. And I was born and raised in Hong Kong, and I'm so thankful that my parents gave me that opportunity to travel and learn new cultures and be exposed to so much diversity. Like I think that's sort of second to none. I feel very privileged for that. I also think my mom told me, as somebody who's kind of going through an inflection point in their life right now, career-wise particularly, she constantly reinvented herself and said that was okay. So she was a paralegal. She owned her own restaurant. She was a buyer for Estee Lauder at Harrods in London. She was a PR manager for the Peninsula Hotel in Hong Kong. Like, she really didn't let one thing define her. And I think probably one of the most important things and why I respected her so much is, apart from her seeing me, she always saw me, she knew when I was up, she knew when I was down, she knew all of me. Was she faced a lot of hardship and adversity in her life, but she didn't let that define her or victimize her. She turned it into something productive. And also at some point used her passion for it. So she wrote a book actually that Penguin wanted to publish that she never actually published, called Too Many Mothers to Love, about her childhood, which was very tough. And so she channeled that into writing, which she found really cathartic. And even when she had cancer, she wrote poems about cancer and got them published in the Daily Mail. So I think it was just a testament to, like, she definitely wanted to, even in times of darkness, try to find the light in whatever she was doing as well. Yeah. So there's many things I've taken away from my mom. But those are some of the ones that really like stand out and have really helped define me as a person as well.
Yeah, that's incredible. Thank you for sharing. I mean, just thinking about people that see the light and that have the ability to see the light in the dark moments, to have somebody that you were as close to as you were with your mom be able to exhibit that is a pretty tremendous gift. It sounds like.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. You were a people leader before you lost your mom. I'm curious. Can you talk a little bit about your general perspective of loss and bereavement, especially in the workplace, before you experienced your own close loss?
Yeah, I think it was very much on the periphery, obviously, by comparison to what it now feels like. I feel like I wasn't equipped for what was to come. I feel like I hadn't sought out the support, whether it was people in my life who'd gone through things of a similar nature, or frankly, a therapist or anyone to really help me kind of get through. I also think, we all hopefully exhibit empathy and compassion, and I had that for people that were going through it. I just don't feel like I fully understood it until I went through it. I think the way I describe it is, it hit me between the eyes when it happened. And I think we always talk about, like, philosophically, that we're all going to pass and die at one point, but it's not until, like, you have somebody that's so close to you, that is front and center to you, that is imminently going, that you fully recognize that. I also didn't fully understand, like, how anticipatory grief can really take hold of you as well. Sure. So I think my biggest challenge when I was working was, I knew, and I know some people don't even have that benefit. Some people lose people very quickly and very suddenly. I knew that I had 3 to 6 months with my mom, and which I'm glad I had the time, but also I feel like I started to mourn her before I lost her. And my heart goes out to people that have also gone through that now, understanding, because it's very hard to focus on the day-to-day stuff when you're going through something, because everything feels very trivial. And you don't know how you can be there for other people when you can barely be there for yourself or for your loved one going through that. So I really think pardon my French, I knew shit about this topic, but beforehand, I think going through it teaches you a lot. And I also believe that life experiences now force you to change too. Like, when people say, "Oh, do you think people can change?" I'm like, life experiences like this change you as well, and sort of get you to reevaluate certain things in your life as well.
Yeah. Wow. You talked a little bit. You said the words compassion and empathy, and some places have it, some places don't. Workplaces, some people have it and some people don't, right? But when you think about whether you have that or not, and you think about the anticipatory grief that sets in, and you described it as having trouble to focus on kind of the day-to-day, right? Thinking about, like, you in a work environment.
Yep.
I would imagine that bled over to work for you. I mean, I'm making an assumption. Can you talk a little bit about how that trouble to focus on the day-to-day kind of showed up in your work life?
Yeah, I can. I think, well, first of all, like it's always interesting because, of course, and this goes back to like why I think we need to be talking about it more. Some people, as you can imagine, also, addressed it with me, and some people did not. Some people also, I will say, one person that worked with me, and obviously I hold no grudges against this person today, but somebody said to me, I hope things go well. And I was like, well, nothing about in my mind, I was like, nothing about this is going to go well because she's going to pass away. Now, I knew this person didn't sort of manage emotionally sensitive, situations very well. So I wasn't surprised by this person saying it, but it also reinforced why people need training. People need to understand like how to approach these conversations if they haven't been through it or they're not so comfortable talking about it. I think that as far as the day-to-day goes, I was just constantly thinking about wanting to be with her and had guilt about being so far away, her being in the UK and me being in the US. So one thing that I did find that was at least helpful was that I think the last couple months from April, once I got that diagnosis, I asked to work 1 week a month on Pacific hours from the UK, which I appreciated the flexibility that my employer gave with that. But as you can imagine, leaving each month was really hard because again, I felt so torn. I know I needed to work. I know I needed, I know I needed to be there for my team, for the leadership team, but I also knew that my priority was really my mom and spending as much time with her, knowing it was so finite, right? So, to your point, what ended up happening is I ended up taking a sabbatical the second half of the year just so I could spend as much time with her. And, I'm not saying that's the right decision for everyone, but it was definitely the right decision for me. Because I just, like I said, I just felt like the things that were showing up at work didn't compare to the things that I was dealing with and the emotions I was trying to process as well. And at that point, I also started re-engaging my therapist because I realized I couldn't do this by myself. I'm somebody that earlier on in my career, earlier on in life, I used to say, oh, I can figure this out. This is just not something you can mess with, not something. And I was like, I need somebody to help. And fortunately enough, I say unfortunately, for my therapist had just suddenly lost her father when I re-engaged her. So she had personally gone through this as well. But I would just say it made me look at the workplace in a whole different way. And honestly, for companies like Bereave or other companies that do similar things, it sort of shone a light on like, we really don't talk about these topics enough. We really don't educate our staff enough on this. We really are still doing the bare minimum. And it's fairly antiquated. And so I really, I know that wherever I choose to go next, this is going to be really important to me because it affects anyone and everyone.
Sure. Yeah. That's a heavy emotional toll, but also one that you're very freely sharing right now. And it's clear, just kind of taking a glance at the comments, that it resonates a ton.
Yeah.
And then, thank you for A, talking about it, and B, giving people an opportunity to connect with you and with each other here. You said something about the bare minimum understanding of grief in the workplace. I'm curious, why do you think that is? Like, why do you think that's the way work exists today, and the understanding of grief and the understanding of loss is at the bare minimum?
I mean, I don't think there's like any real bad intent. I just think there's been a lack of time spent on really thinking about it, spending the time to figure out what is going on. And, or maybe because it's such a personal topic area, either, maybe certain HR teams or other things haven't received enough feedback, or so they don't think it's necessarily a problem, right? Usually,
Mhm.
I mean, certain HR functions, I would say, they're kind of firefighters. They're reacting to things that they're hearing. But I think
Mhm.
the danger is, just because you're not hearing about something doesn't mean it's not a problem, right?
Right. Right.
And I think that this is one of those areas. And I think, look, don't get me wrong, like, it's great that companies have bereavement policies. It's great that we have EAP. But I think in this day and age, where we're going through so much and people are in remote hybrid setups, like, that's just not enough
Mhm.
anymore.
Mhm.
And you don't have the opportunity to see people even potentially every day or at all. So you don't really know what they're going through. So I
Sure.
think providing more access to resources or getting more creative about how you can help people becomes
Mhm.
so much more important.
Totally. Totally. And I think you hit on something there that people ask a lot about, is like remote supports. Like, we don't know sometimes. Even if we ask, we don't know. But if we welcome the conversation, if we make the conversation okay
Yeah.
by initiating it and providing resources, even if we never know utilization rates, as an example, uh, then the topic becomes much more, the support becomes much more accessible,
Yeah.
and people feel that safety to be able to have those difficult conversations. Have you in your leadership roles, have you been in a situation where you have felt one company, and you don't need to name names, but might be a little bit more grief informed than another, or has it been pretty flat, consistent across your roles?
I think it's been pretty flat. I'm going to
Yeah.
be honest. I think that this, I I hate to say it's as a reaction, also as a moment in time, and that sort of it's something that you can capitalize off. But like,
Mhm.
I think the nature of us having gone through so much in the last few years and having to reevaluate, what we bring to work and our personal and professional lives blending. I think
Mhm.
this is now a necessary topic that companies need to focus on that they didn't necessarily focus on before. And also, it's an uncomfortable conversation. And depending
Mhm.
on the type of company you are, certain companies are risk averse. Certain companies don't want to confront the hard stuff. So it really
Mhm.
speaks to like the sort of culture that you're building at your company as well.
Mhm.
Like, do you want to be informed of people's trauma or what they're going through
Mhm.
or their grief? If you don't, then these are the sort of conversations that you won't wrestle with, and you won't go to get to that next stage, right? As well.
Mhm.
But I do think that if you do actually open up this dialogue, I mean, think about like how it can build community, how it can improve employee retention and engagement,
Mhm.
because people recognize like you're putting actions behind your words. Not just kind of, it's not just something else that goes on a website, that like,
Totally.
it's actually something you're doing.
Right, right. I mean, you use the word community there, and people want to develop. We hear a lot that companies try to develop a community, right, and try to be people first and recognize the, I'm going to use air quotes here, whole employee. Um, and I think one of the things that we've observed is that a lot of those companies miss the opportunity to develop this community. It is the world's largest community, likely, arguably, of people who have suffered loss. And we hear all the
Yep.
time people say, like, hey, I don't bring it up in conversation. I don't talk about it because I don't want to make anybody uncomfortable.
Hmm.
And I don't know what they've been through, but I've been in the room, and I'm sure you have, when two people realize, like is happening today in the chat, two people realize they have suffered a close loss at a similar time, maybe in a similar way or similar relationship. And that community, that connection instantly bonds. And
Yeah.
that, for that to be able to happen, inside or outside work, is has been described to me anyway as a massive relief, and very, very welcomed in many situations. As you think about, you're
And
talking
sorry,
about,
I
well,
just
yeah, go
I
ahead.
was just going to say to that,
Yeah.
like, just thinking off what you said, is I also think it's more about the individual's discomfort, right? They
Hmm.
don't want to
Sure.
talk about it, but they pin it on the person that's going
Hmm.
through that. And I would say, from my own grief journey, I think words matter, and you really need to listen to what somebody's saying so you know how to appropriately respond.
Hmm.
I know that
Hmm.
immediately when I lost my mom, I got an outpouring of support from people, like, and which was amazing, but also I felt paralyzed, like in terms of being able to respond. It was too much to respond to. And I basically even went out with a message and said, I need a minute, right? Like, I appreciate all of you, but I need a minute. But then I will say in the coming days or weeks after that, I felt incredibly alone. And so I actually wanted to engage in conversation, right? So I think it goes back to your point, like, unless people receive more training, unless they're listening, unless we're starting to think about this in a different, more creative way, it's becoming part of a normalized conversation and dialogue. Like, we're not going to break through some of these things, you know?
Yeah, totally. You've mentioned culture a couple of times. We've talked a little bit about community. We've referenced the word compassion and empathy. I'm curious, like, why do you think compassion and empathy, loss aside, compassion and empathy are important today in the workplace?
I think they're so important because of the fact that it shows that you know how to be vulnerable, number one. It also shows that you're trying to relate and you're trying to put forward the human side in yourself. I also think that if you can share stories and try to relate, it cultivates more trust amongst the employees around you. And also sometimes, like, you know, some of this is education for people, especially if they haven't been through things before, right? But I don't think people are going to feel comfortable talking about what they're going through if they don't feel like the person on the other side of the table is receptive and open to what they've got to say. And that's why empathy and compassion plays such a huge part. And, you know, I have heard some awful stories from, friends and colleagues in the past where that's not always been the case, right? And people have lost loved ones and then are expected to get back to work in a couple of days. And it's been very sort of cut and dry. And, I'm actually most disappointed for their managers who kind of took that approach, because I feel for them the day they lose someone and they may rethink, God, why have I treated employees that reported to me like this? Because I need time and space now. So
Totally.
I feel for those people who may have a full circle moment, you know?
Yeah. That's a great call out. I mean, there was a high profile in the news, Johnson & Johnson SVP of something, an executive role of a 30,000 person company, 30,000 plus, suffered a very close loss of a child. And his bereavement policy, I think, was like 5 days. And he came back, took time off, but came back and immediately made the change. And I think now Johnson & Johnson offers 30 days. I think it is, take it when you want it. Right. So it's non-consecutive, but they really looked into that. But up until that point, until that leader with that amount of decision-making power and that amount of voice had that happen, it was 5 days for
and
the child. Right.
Well, and that's the thing. It's like when you kind of leave it to one person at the top to just be defining what it looks like for an entire company and culture, that becomes very dangerous, whether it's for policies, whether it's for diversity, equity, inclusion, for a number of things. And you're never going to make everyone happy with whatever you come up with, but you should really have a pulse on what your people think, right? As far as their needs. And you hit on something that's really important to me now, having gone through it, is like, we do need to get more creative about policies. I mean, these these antiquated policies don't really work. Like, I would say I'm very thankful for the flexible work aspect that I got, spending like 1 week out of a month working from the UK. I know that wouldn't necessarily be possible for everyone, but I love that I was managed to get creative with my company. I also think we know grief isn't linear. So this kind of like, hey, you get 5 days off and then you're meant to turn back up to work and just carry on with life is not necessarily realistic. I think there's an opportunity to think about time off for grief on a more intermittent basis. Like, maybe you need to take it at different points throughout a year, right? And you're also going to be faced with different life events where things could really trigger or hit you, and you may need a day off. And, I guess there's different ways that what you could call that. but I'm just saying, like, the grief is not going to just happen in that first week. It's going to happen at different times. And
Right.
I think we need to recognize that.
Sure.
And I also think something that I know heard from a client the other day that I have actually talked about before is creating some sort of emergency fund or crisis fund as well, because that's why I think spending accounts are so important these days, whether they're emergency, lifestyle, because everyone has different needs, but like being able to know that you've got some sort of something to turn to, even financially, when something like this happens is really important to people, right? And I know people who haven't even been able to pay for funeral costs. So I like having things like that. We just need to be having these conversations as well.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And for those that want specifics, Clayton Tyner, I believe I saw on the call there. He's in Kansas City, Worcester Investments. He and his team were the ones that came up with that fund. Company paid for, which is a really cool policy, really forward thinking policy. And we've seen others. I mean, Cocoon in San Francisco, who has a what they refer to as a empathy leave policy, right, tacked on to bereavement for other areas of life that can be used in multiple ways, right? So they're really thinking about like life in general, right, and tying bereavement time to the time it takes to produce a funeral, typically, right? A wedding scale event that you have to go do. You don't even get a moment to think about anything else, but you've got to go put on this wedding scale event in 5 days, and then you go back to work and you're like, hey, I'm back at my desk to hit my quota, right? Like, gotta start prospecting, I guess. It's just not aligned with what actually occurs in life.
And Justin, I would also add to that, and looking at some of the comments, I think a good call out tied to that is people that additionally have played the role of caregiver to those individuals, right?
Totally.
I know my mother and my dad did to my mom for many years. I can see some people did for their parents on here. Like, that is even harder, because not only have you now potentially lost your identity of being a caregiver for that, you're also exhausted. You're trying to figure out your own emotions, and then you're trying to process grief. Like, that is so much to do, and that is not going to happen in a short linear period of time. And I think anyone that thinks that would happen in a short space of time isn't realistic, and frankly is naive as well.
Yeah, totally. We've talked a little bit about kind of like the typical way companies have shown up, right? Are there ways? I mean, you mentioned the crisis fund. I mentioned the empathy leave. Are there other ways that you have seen companies or heard about companies showing up in a little bit more progressive ways to be able to support people during loss or caregiving moments?
Yeah, I think that what I'm starting to hear is more companies like Bereave actually going in there and providing more training around what loss looks like for individuals, how, cues to pick up on, true training around it. And I think, which is really great, because I think when people classically think of quote unquote learning and development or training, they don't necessarily put grief training into that bucket. So I'm starting to particularly hear from my friends who work in sort of more progressive companies who are kind of sort of dialing into these. They're starting to see more of this, but it's still very light by comparison. Those folks are very much in the minority. So I think that needs to become more widespread, because and we all know death is universal. So it is something that it's not, we have programs and other things in place for things that don't even affect everyone. This is something that affects everyone. So to me, it's a no-brainer that we need training around it as well. So I think it's the combination of that. The other thing I would say is HR teams aren't even equipped really to talk about this. It's not just a question that a lot of them haven't necessarily been through loss, which I think shapes the narrative in itself, but they haven't been trained on these topics equally. So I'm not just talking about business leaders, employees, I'm also talking about HR leaders. And I think, and I could be accused of the same, frankly, in a prior life, I think the easy button was to just be like, okay, this is not something that was part of our job. We're not trained therapists, so we're just going to hand you over to EAP. Now, don't get me wrong, some of those things are still true today. We're not trained therapists, although we coach a lot and sometimes feel like therapists. But I think there is an opportunity to get trained up and provide more than a handoff to EAP, and to act as more of an intermediary, and kind of do that in tandem with that. And I think some of that also comes from a fear of, companies knowing too much. And, if you know too much, what does that mean? And what if this person's performance declines and things of that nature? So I think some people worry about the risk aversion that comes with it. But I also think we're all going to go through it. So we need to be able to understand and talk about it. And frankly, if performance declines for a period of time, you actually have a better understanding as to the why as well. So that's kind of where my head is at right now.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what we've learned in the conversations, the interviews, the surveys, these types of conversations, people who have just shown up in our world to tell us about their loss experience and their journey. There is so much that an HR team and frontline managers can be doing that do not even come close to sniffing needing a grief certification, right?
Correct.
There's just a level of understanding and a few tactical things that they can think through to make the experience maybe softer and more compassionate and more welcoming and I know that might sound weird to talk about it welcoming, but you think about somebody coming back from a leave, right? How do you receive that person back in? How do you prepare the team that is there, right? How do you prepare those 8 people on that team and help them understand what to say, what not to say, a little bit about what this person might be going through, especially if you've never been through it yourself. And those moments turn out to be incredibly critical from what we've seen, not just in the relationship between teammates, but the relationship between how that person then thinks about the relationship with that employer. It all starts to bubble up into that level of thinking through that relationship.
I also think, Justin, that we also have to recognize that different businesses are at different points of maturity in in terms of how they relate to their employees and their people strategy. So I always talk about like the 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. Like some people aren't even at the 1.0. Some people are trying to get from the 2.0 to the 3.0. So you also have to recognize where you're at as a company, right? So you know like where you can go next. And so, I think I saw Julie's comment, for example, in the chat. Yeah, we're not grief counselors in HR. And she mentions mental health training. I agree. I think the 1.0 actually for a lot of companies is getting their employees mental health training. I don't know if you saw Goldman Sachs has now announced last month that they're doing mental health training for all their employees, right? And that's a big start, especially as we're just starting Mental Health Awareness Month, right? That is another thing that is so prevalent in our environment as well. So I do need to think. And also, I think the other thing to keep in mind is this is one of those topics where it's always like, oh, this is something that HR just does. And it's like, actually, no, it doesn't just live with us. We may be the stewards of it in a lot of ways, but it's everyone's responsibility to be thinking about this because everyone works on a team, right? Is part of a team, whether they're an individual contributor or a leader. So these are things that we should be doing, right? And so to help us know how to show up in the workplace as well.
Yeah, love those points. I love the idea of the 1.0 to 3.0. Like I'm curious, and you started to think about some examples that might fall into those categories. Where do you feel like grief and loss falls on that scale? Maybe that's a loaded question.
Say that again.
Where do you feel that if you're at 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 in maturity, like where does grief and loss start to get plugged in?
Yeah,
really understanding that.
I think that probably more so at the 2.0, I would say. Like I think the 1.0 is, I think for some companies it might be a stretch to jump straight there if they've really had no conversations even around things like mental health or things like that. So it's kind of a little bit
Sure.
like building blocks, and also having worked for so many different companies, some that were very comfortable with change and some that were change adverse, frankly. If you try to throw too much at people too soon, they'll resist. So I think you've also got to think about how you can take a little bit of a phased approach. Now, if you're already doing mental health training in the workplace, like Goldman Sachs is now doing, or other companies are already doing it, I think there's now an opportunity to take it to that next level at some point. So that's where I go back to, like, you've got to think about where you are as a company and as a business. And I think certain businesses are doing amazing things with their people as far as having very open, people-centric dialogues around this, and other people far behind that on the curve as well. Yeah, let's put it that way.
Yeah. You and I can probably sit and I can tell you a few stories about the levels of maturation in companies that we talk to. So let's let me hit this. If you're starting from scratch, let's assume that some of those building blocks and that foundation has been set, and you are now working with a leadership team to build out. Maybe let's even say you're working with a leadership team and some committee of people from, call it, the front lines. So you've got all the right stakeholders potentially, and you're starting to build out a bereavement response from scratch.
Yep.
Okay, what are some of the things you're including? I'm not asking you to say, "Hey, I'm including bereavement." I'm not asking you to do that.
No.
But conceptually, what are some of the things that you're helping them think about?
Yeah, I think, for that, getting inputs from different types of stakeholders that have gone through different experiences is going to be super key. So I would want to try and conduct some level of a focus group of sorts, or one-on-one conversation. Actually, maybe one-on-one conversations, just because the nature of the sensitivity of the topic. Because the other thing you got to recognize is this is not one of those topics where people necessarily feel comfortable, at least immediately, sharing within a group. But I'd like to do one-on-one conversations and definitely talk to people who've not experienced grief, and the sort of questions and concerns they have when they hear about somebody losing somebody in the workplace, right? Because I think there's going to be some themes there that you hit with a lot of people about not knowing the right things to say, when to engage, things of that nature, right? And then people who've actually been through loss, right? What actually went okay or went well? What did they appreciate that their employer did when it happened? What could have gone better? What do they feel was missing? What would they like to see in the future, right? And then also talk to the HR team is going to be really important. Like, how do they feel they're going to be best equipped to support people that are going through grief as well? I do think, and don't get me wrong, leadership is important from the buy-in, but as far as, I don't know if it'd be a controversial opinion or not, they're the least important as far as the content that's being built and the support that needs to be provided. I would be looking at leadership more so to endorse and advocate what we put together versus being a key constituent. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm sure some people in leadership will have gone through their own loss or have similar questions to employees, and I want to hear those.
Sure. Totally.
But I think it's taking it to a grassroots level and getting thoughtful points. And you're going to have to constantly, it's not a one and done. This is the other thing. It's like anything. You've got to evolve it and make sure you're meeting people where they're at over time as well. And I think that's the problem with what's out there right now. It's been so long since we've really had honest conversations about it that what's out there it's very tried and tested, but it feels quite antiquated, like we talked about before.
Sure. Yeah. A lot of bereavement policies, frankly, kind of reflect like dress code policies. It's like, it's just very cut and dry. This is the way we do it. And don't take a whole lot of thought or process like you outlined. So thank you for sharing that. We're getting close to time. You did such a beautiful job of telling us about Sandy, and sort of the wisdom that she imparted on you, and thus via today on a lot of us. So we're grateful that you were able to do that, and thankful. Anything specific from an HR people leader perspective that you think is the most important, even in summary, or any additional new thoughts, the most important things that people leave here today with?
Yeah, I would say if you're crafting or thinking about talking about grief in the workplace, don't figure it out by yourself. Seek out people around you that have either experienced it, whether it's fellow chief people officers, whether it's people in the business, like getting different perspectives, because there's so many different stories and about what people go through with grief. You know, we've talked about some people are caregivers, some people are not. Some people lose individuals who aren't what I call quote unquote traditional family, and they don't even show up in a policy, right? I know I have what I call, in addition to my own family, my chosen logical family, right? And I just think that getting more information will provide you with more perspective, but don't go in and try and formulate something without having done the work, having done the research, sort out people in your personal board of directors, as I like to call them, your personal network, because I think you'll be missing the mark somewhere in terms of, and whereas if you get all that information, you're going to have something that's way more well-rounded and applicable for people.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Alex, I mean, we're so grateful for you being here today. So grateful for your vulnerability and willingness to share. It is so clear, and I haven't been able to hit the comments nearly as much as I would have liked to, but it is so clear that you are developing, helping develop a community, that the things that you have said have touched a nerve in some way and have developed a connection here today. So thank you for that. That's a difficult thing to do. It's a difficult thing to have these conversations, but the way you've shown up here today is impacting a lot of people, and we can't thank you enough for that.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate having the platform just to honor my mom, but also equally try and shine a light and get more eyes on this conversation, and for it to be a continuous arc. Like, this is not something that drops off, but it's just something that, like I said, we normalize and becomes part of the daily life. Not something that people fear talking about, but people can get comfortable with.
Yeah, you got it. Love it. And also thanked Alex, but thank you to so many of you who helped with that connection today. A lot of you, again, I'll need to go back and look at these, but so kind and generous and vulnerable and brave to be able to share the things that you shared as well in the chat. For those that need it or want it, the SHRM PDC code is available. We will also send that to you, follow up. A lot of you mentioned specifically talking about mental health first aid and mental health awareness and training. Good news, the best news on that specific topic for you today is that Jamie Conrad, who many of you probably know is the VP of People at Trust Radius, is actually going to be here at Loss Leaders with us in 2 weeks on May 17th to talk specifically about mental health first aid. So if that is something that is of interest, come see Jamie on May 17th. We'll be out, putting it on LinkedIn as we normally do. I said earlier that Bereave is on a mission to help companies provide a better bereavement experience when their teammates suffer a loss. Alex outlined a ton of things that we are doing and helping companies with. So if you're a people leader and want to understand how to do that, even if you think you're great at it and you think you've got it locked in, we have been very fortunate to learn from so many people, and we have built everything that we do around those stories. So we'd love to talk to you about what we've learned and how to become a Bereave customer at some point if it fits what you're doing in your role. Alex, thank you again. We can't thank you enough. We'll talk soon. Everybody else, we'll see you on May 17th.